The Sonoran Desert does not apologize for anything. It sits under the Arizona sun the way it has sat for longer than any human institution has existed. Patient, indifferent, present. The heat shimmer above the tarmac at Blue Mesa Air Force Base looked on most afternoons exactly the same as it had looked 30 years ago. The desert had been here before the first runway was poured. It would be here after the last engine went quiet. It kept no record of the small dramas that played out across its surface, and it offered no comfort to the people who built their lives there. Sarah Voss moved through that heat like someone who had made her peace with being unnoticed. She walked the flight line with her head down, badge hanging loose around her neck. Coveralls faded to the color of old concrete. The coveralls had her last name stenciled above the breast pocket, Voss, in letters washed enough times that they barely showed. To the young pilots who jogged past her on their way to the F-16 apron, she was just another contractor. The civilian workforce that kept the base running, the mechanics, the avionics techs, the people who arrived before dawn and left after dark, and whose names nobody learned. She had a badge. She had a clearance. She had calloused hands and a checklist, and that was enough to make her invisible. She had spent 6 years making sure nothing about her showed too clearly. Hangar 3 sat at the far end of the flight line, away from the modern aircraft that drew attention and budget. The F-16s were up near the tower in their hardened shelters, clean and contemporary and well-loved. Hangar 3 was where things went when people did not know what to do with them anymore. Old ground support equipment, spare parts that fit nothing currently in the inventory. And in Bay 14, against the back wall, half in shadow, even in the middle of the day, one A-10 Thunderbolt II. The young pilots called it the Hog. Sometimes they said it affectionately the way you talk about an old dog that still lives in the house. More often they said it with the polite distance of people who had moved past something and were not sure why it was still around. The A-10 was not elegant, it was not fast. It had been designed in the 1970s to kill Soviet tanks on a European battlefield that never came. It was built around its cannon, the way a revolver is built around its barrel. Everything else secondary, everything else in service of the weapon. Squat, angular, its cockpit sitting high and exposed like the head of something prehistoric. It had been shot at more times than any other aircraft in the American inventory, and it had come home more times than it had any right to. Sarah knew every bolt in its skin. She had known this particular airframe for 11 years. She set her clipboard on the workbench and pulled on her inspection gloves. Her morning check started the way it always started, at the nose working back along the fuselage toward the twin tail. Her hands moved without instruction. Left hand on the skin reading for stress fractures and surface irregularities. Right hand making notations she had already memorized. The motion was as natural as any motion she had. Her left hand touched the breast pocket of her coveralls without her deciding to do it. She stopped. The pocket was flat against her chest. There was something folded inside it, small and stiff the way certain fabrics get when they have been folded and carried long enough that the fold becomes permanent. She pressed her palm flat against it. Just a moment. Then she moved her hand back to the aircraft and continued. She had not taken it out in 6 years. Walt Gibbs arrived at 7:45, the same time he always arrived, carrying the dented thermos he had carried every working morning for as long as Sarah had known him. He was 62 years old, and he moved like a man who had spent 4 decades with large machines carefully, with the economy of someone who knew exactly what his body could and could not do. Deep lines in his face from years of Arizona sun, white hair at the temples, close cropped. Eyes that were pale and direct without being harsh. He had worked at Blue Mesa for 27 years. 4 base commanders come and gone. The A-10 fleet reduced from a full squadron to a training attachment to 1 aircraft in a half-empty hangar. He never complained about this. He just arrived at 7:45 and did his work. When Sarah had first come to Blue Mesa 6 years ago in October with a contractor badge listing her specialty as airframe maintenance and her previous employer as a defense services firm that had never actually employed her, Walt had looked at her badge for a long moment. Not the name, the badge number, the clearance tier, the alphanumeric code in the lower right corner that meant nothing to anyone who did not know what it meant. He had looked at it for 3 full seconds, then handed it back, and never said a word to anyone about what he had seen. This morning he set his thermos on the workbench, poured a cup, and walked to where Sarah was working on the starboard engine intake. He stood beside her without speaking. This was normal. They often worked in silence for long stretches. Then he said, "I ordered the secondary hydraulic seals last Thursday. Came in yesterday. I put them in the parts bin under the bench." Sarah kept her eyes on the intake. "Those aren't on the maintenance schedule." "No," she looked at him then. He was looking at the aircraft, not at her. "Walt," her voice was quiet. "Show me." He walked her to the workbench. Under the lower shelf behind a standard parts bin was a second bin unmarked, pushed against the wall. He opened it. Inside, hydraulic seals, throttle quadrant bushings, two avionics interface cards of a type out of production for 8 years, and a folder of handwritten maintenance notes dating back to 2019. Sarah looked at the folder. She did not touch it. "How long?" she said. "6 years. The parts costs are mine." He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. "Everything's logged clean as disposal from other aircraft. Nobody's looked twice." He paused. "The airframe is flight ready, Sarah, has been for about 14 months. She stood very still. Outside the hangar, she could hear F-16Es taxiing toward the runway. The thin, high whine of their engines, nothing like the deep turbine groan of the machine in front of ear. The sound of the present tense. "You shouldn't have done this," she said. Walt picked up his coffee. He looked at the aircraft for a long moment, the look of a man who has given something years of quiet attention and is simply acknowledging the fact of it. Then very quietly, "The day you quit wasn't the day you stopped being a pilot." He walked back to his workbench. He did not say anything else. Sarah stood with one hand resting against the fuselage, and the hangar held its silence around them both. There is a specific quality to desert light in the late afternoon that pilots learn before they learn almost anything else. It comes in low and amber, hitting the landscape at an angle that makes everything look older than it is. It catches the leading edges of wings and turns them gold. It makes the mountains to the west look closer than they are. It has no sentiment about what it illuminates. It simply falls where it falls. Sarah ate lunch alone at a table near the back of the contractor facility. She ate without tasting. Her mind was elsewhere. It went there sometimes despite everything she had done to keep it in the present. The Kunar Valley was not a place she had expected to remember this clearly for this long. It was autumn 2019 when the tasking came through, standard close air support coordination, the kind that happened dozens of times on any given day in that part of the world. A ground element taking fire from the high ground east of a narrow valley. The forward air controller had called for a strike. The coordinates had been verified through the intelligence chain brigade level, then division, then the document giving the precise grid reference for a target positively identified as an enemy command position. The document was signed by Brigadier General Orrin Bast. Sarah had flown the mission as briefed, her flight of 4 A-10s. She had led them in from the south using the valley walls for cover, and she had rolled in on the designated coordinates and done her job. Clean, professional, by the book. What none of them had known was that the coordinates had been adjusted. Not by much. Enough to shift the target from the ridge to the valley floor. Enough to pull her aircraft into a flight path that had been anticipated. Enough to put 3 of her pilots into a box canyon that had been turned into a kill zone, while she and her wingman broke left on instinct and survived. Kowalski had gone into the ridge wall. Garrett had taken a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile and come apart in the air. Morrow had tried to punch out, and the ejection seat had malfunctioned. Sarah had circled the canyon for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before being ordered to egress. She knew the time it bought because she had watched the mission clock every few seconds, waiting for something to change. Nothing had changed. The investigation ran 11 months. Findings classified. What Sarah had been told in a windowless office at a base she was not permitted to name in writing was that General Bast had authorized modified coordinates based on ground intelligence, suggesting the original target had been vacated. He had believed that intelligence. It had been wrong. The official finding, no individual had acted with malicious intent. Tragedy, fog of war, the language that gets used when the paperwork needs to close. What she had learned through the grapevine that exists among people who have served and bled together and will not let each other simply disappear was different. At the moment the modified coordinates were issued, 200 Army infantrymen were pinned down in the valley to the east being overrun. Bast had made a calculation. He had decided that the risk to Sarah's flight was acceptable if it drew enemy attention long enough for the infantry to break contact. He had not decided to kill Kowalski and Garrett and Morrow. He had decided that their survival was a lower priority than the survival of the men on the ground. Sarah had thought about this distinction for 6 years, not in ordered sentences and images. Kowalski's laugh. The way Garrett always wore her helmet slightly tilted to the left, a habit no one had ever explained. Morrow writing letters he never sent, leaving them in his rack to be found and forwarded after. She thought about the fact that she had given the order, that she had been the aircraft commander, that no matter how far back you trace the information chain, the final call had lived in her and 3 people who trusted her with that call had not come home. She thought about this, and then she went back to work, and she kept her badge turned inward so her name faced her chest, and she touched the fold in her breast pocket and did not open it. This was how she had lived for 6 years. This was what living with it looked like from the inside. She was finishing her coffee when the pager on her belt buzzed. The base-wide alert siren is not a subtle instrument. It begins with a single high-pitched tone, sharp, almost polite, the kind of sound that makes you pause mid-sentence. Then the second stage. Lower longer the frequency that bypasses your ears and arrives at something older. The kind of sound your body answers before your mind finishes processing it. Sarah was already on her feet before the PA system opened. The voice was stripped of everything except information. Multiple hostile vehicles confirmed in Devil's Backbone Pass, 22 miles northeast. Armored convoy with electronic countermeasures. Current heading Blue Mesa Dam. Estimated time to dam perimeter 9 minutes. All close air support assets scramble. For 2 seconds, the flight line was completely still. Then it came apart. Pilots sprinting for the F-16 shelters, helmets swinging from their hands. Ground crews moving in the opposite direction toward hardened positions. Fuel trucks repositioning. The high whine of F-16 engines beginning to spool urgent climbing people, doing everything they could as fast as they could do it. Sarah stood on the tarmac outside Hangar 3 and looked northeast toward the mountains where Devil's Backbone Pass cut through the high country. She knew that canyon. She had made it her business to know every major terrain feature within 50 miles of every base she had ever been assigned to, because the day you needed that knowledge was never the day you had time to acquire it. She knew what the backbone would do to a fast mover. The canyon ran no more than 300 feet across in its narrowest section near the dam approach. Walls sheer sandstone baked and fractured 400 feet on the north side and 600 on the south. 2 significant bends, a gradual left turn at 1.5 miles, then a hard right that came up faster than any map suggested, the kind of turn that caught you if you were thinking about anything except the turn itself. An F-16 at combat speed had a turning radius that made the second bend a serious problem. You could make it if you were willing to fly slower than an F-16, wanted to fly at altitude margins that left almost nothing for error in a canyon where the walls were as dangerous as anything on the ground. The radio on her belt crackled. She had kept it on the open tactical frequency out of habit, the same habit that had kept it clipped to her belt every working day for 6 years. The habit of someone who had taken herself out of the game but could not make herself stop listening. The voice was controlled and tight. The voice of a man who was watching something he could not stop and doing everything possible to make sure someone else could. This is SEAL Recon Alpha. I have eyes on the convoy. 4 armored vehicles, 2 jammer trucks, shoulder fire anti-air on the escort vehicles. F-16s are attempting ingress. Jammer strength is degrading all targeting systems. We cannot support. You have approximately 8 minutes before lead elements reach the spillway road. A pause. Then quieter. It's too late. Sarah looked at the radio. She looked at the canyon on the horizon. She looked at Hangar 3. She walked through the door. Walt was already there, standing beside the A-10, looking at it with the particular attention of someone who knows a machine better than almost anyone alive. He heard her footsteps and turned. He read her face the way he had learned to read it over 6 years of working beside her. He set down what he was holding. She said, "Start the pre-flight." He nodded once and moved to the nose. Chief Leland Burke was 29 years old with a good eye for aircraft and a gift for logistics and no frame of reference for what was unfolding in front of him. He stood at the edge of the tarmac watching the F-16 begin their taxi and running the same arithmetic Sarah had already run. He had been listening to the tactical channel. He had done the math. He was young, but he was not slow. He called out across the tarmac, "Who's current on the hog?" Silence. People moving around him, past him. Nobody stopping. "Anybody who has current quals on the A-10?" A voice behind him. "I do." He turned. The woman in the faded coveralls stood at the entrance to Hangar 3. Her badge was turned inward. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was completely still. Not the stillness of someone unafraid, but the stillness of someone who had decided that fear was not useful input. Burke looked at her. He looked at her badge. He looked back at her face. "Ma'am, are you even—" She lifted the badge and turned it so he could read it. He read it once. He read it again. Voss Sarah L. USAF Reserve inactive. 74th Fighter Squadron. Call sign Ghost 9. Airframe qualification A-10C. The name landed in the space between them and sat there. Burke was too young to know it fully, but he knew enough. He had heard it the way you hear certain names spoken in the tone people reserve for things that happened before you were paying attention, things that people who were paying attention never forgot. From the back of the hangar, Walt Gibbs said without looking up, "Burke, get your crew in here, load her out." Burke was still looking at the badge. He looked up at Sarah. He keyed his radio. Colonel Marcus Webb's voice came over the command frequency before Burke finished his transmission. Flat measured the voice of a man who had not reached his rank by making impulsive decisions. "Voss, you are not on flight status. You do not have current currency. This is not, Colonel." Her voice carried the same temperature as the afternoon. "Your fighters cannot make that second bend at combat speed. Your drones are running blind in that jamming envelope. That canyon has a rock shelf at the entry to the second bend that will take a wing off anything going too fast. I have flown that canyon. I have flown it at night." A pause precisely long enough. "That aircraft is flight ready. I am qualified on that airframe. You have approximately 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Make a decision. Static on the channel, 3 seconds. 5. Then Burke, load her high, rockets and Mavericks, full gun drum, move." The hangar came alive. Burke's crew materialized from 3 directions simultaneously. Fuel lines hissed. The ammunition handling system cycled in the AU-8's drum, 1,174 rounds of depleted uranium. Each shell the length of a man's hand confirmed full and ready. Maverick missiles racked on the underwing stations. Rocket pods latched and pinned. Access panels slammed shut in sequence, each one a small percussion in the larger noise of preparation. Sarah was in the cockpit by the time the second Maverick went on the rail. She strapped in without thinking. The harness clicked, home with the sound it makes when it is seated correctly. Not a soft click, a definite one with authority. Instrument scan left to right, top to bottom. Engine gauges, hydraulic pressure, weapon systems, radio. The cockpit smelled the way it always smelled: metal and fuel, and the faint chemical undertone of electronics that have been warmed and cooled hundreds of times. Her hands settled on the throttle quadrant. She held them there for exactly 3 seconds without moving. She was thinking about the last time. The last time she had sat exactly here with her hands in this position, and the mission had gone the way missions sometimes go, when the information you have been given is not the information you needed. She thought Kowalski, Garrett, Morrow. Then she advanced the throttles. The engines caught with their characteristic groan, not the high whine of a fighter, not elegant, not designed to impress. The A-10's engines were designed to be hard to kill. They started the way something starts when it has no interest in whether you find the process beautiful. They started, and the vibration came up through the airframe and into the seat and into her spine, and it felt, despite everything she had done to prevent it from feeling like anything, like something returning to its correct state. She did not allow herself to stay in that feeling. There was no time for it, and there would be a cost to it later that she was not ready to calculate. In the shadow of the maintenance office doorway, Major Doug Crane watched the aircraft begin its taxi. He was 44 years old, trim, with the smooth expression of someone who had learned long ago to keep his face from giving anything away. He held his personal phone in one hand. He was composing a message as the A-10 rolled toward the runway. He finished it. He sent it. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked toward the command post, and his expression did not change at all. Behind him, Chief Leland Burke was doing a final visual check along the port wing station. He stopped at the second Maverick rack. He looked at the safety pin configuration, then at the targeting interface connector. Something about the initialization parameter setting was not right, not wrong in a way that would prevent the missile from firing, but wrong in a way that would force the targeting system to cycle through an additional lock acquisition step before achieving tone. 3, maybe 4 seconds of additional delay. In a weapons employment sequence against a target that was moving 3 seconds was the difference between a shot and a miss. He reached for his radio. The aircraft was already on the runway. The tower cleared her without ceremony. Ghost 9, you are cleared for immediate departure. Devil's Backbone ingress corridor. Good hunting. Sarah pushed the throttles forward, and the Hog accelerated with the particular determination of a machine not built for elegance, but built to be at a certain place at a certain time, doing a certain thing, and now doing exactly that. The desert dropped away beneath her. She kept the climb shallow. Altitude was not what this required. She needed speed she could control, and altitude she could trade for energy in a canyon where the walls were as much an enemy as anything on the ground. She pushed northeast toward the mountains, watching the ridgelines sharpen and rise in the windscreen, the shadows deepening in the cuts between the peaks. Drake Haynes came through on the tactical channel, with the flat precision of a man who had been in situations like this more times than he could count. Ghost 9 SEAL Recon Alpha. Convoy is 2 miles into the backbone, moving at 30 miles per hour. Lead elements are 6 vehicles. Jammers, mid-column. You'll have one clean approach window before they're under the ridge overhang. Copy. A pause. When Haynes spoke again, his voice carried something she recognized, not quite relief, not quite confidence, but the particular shift in a man who has been alone with an impossible problem and suddenly has company. Something you need to know. This convoy's approach corridor was calculated to avoid every defensive asset at this installation. Drone relay positions, radar coverage, F-16 approach corridors, all of it. They had a complete picture of Blue Mesa's capabilities. He paused. They left one gap, Hangar 3. She processed this without speaking. The canyon entrance was growing in her windscreen. They knew you were here, Haynes said, and they left that gap open deliberately. She thought about what that meant. She thought about who at Blue Mesa had access to the full defensive picture. She thought about Crane walking toward the command post with his phone in his pocket. She filed the implications behind the more immediate questions because the canyon was a mile ahead, and the more immediate questions were about staying alive long enough for the other questions to matter. She thought briefly if they set this up knowing Ghost 9 was here, then what they built inside that canyon was not just a convoy route, it was a trap with a specific intended occupant. She pushed the throttles forward and descended to 300 feet. The walls swallowed her. The canyon took her immediately the way canyons do, walls rising faster than your eyes. Expect the sky compressing into a ribbon above the canopy, the sound of the engines changing from a full-throated roar into something more contained, more immediate, bouncing off sandstone and returning altered. The backbone demanded your full attention from the first second and offered nothing back in return. Sarah dropped to 250 feet and held it, feeling the air react to the terrain below. Every canyon has its own aerodynamics, its own pattern of updrafts and compression zones, and turbulent pockets that form where the walls change angle. She had memorized this one from charts and photographs and one low-level transit 7 years ago, in different circumstances, no weapons on the rails flying it because she wanted to know it. That knowledge was in her hands now, not in her mind. In her hands the way real knowledge lives. The first bend came at 1.5 miles, left turn gradual. She took it at speed. The canyon straightened and the convoy came up on the pod display before her eyes resolved, the shape's heat signatures bright and irregular against cooler stone, the thermal output of engines running hard in a confined space. Then the details. 2 columns, 6 vehicles, visible, the jammer trucks identifiable by their flat-topped antenna arrays flanked by escort vehicles with personnel at mounted weapons. She armed the first Maverick. The targeting system cycled. Lock tone steady, clean, exactly what it was supposed to sound like. The lead jammer filled her targeting reticle at 900 meters. 800. The tone held. She fired. The missile left the rail with a hard thump she felt in her shoulders, and she was already braking right to give herself separation from the blast. When the detonation came a rolling orange fireball that lit the canyon walls and sent a pressure wave back at her that she felt in the airframe before she heard it. The lead jammer ceased to exist as a functional unit. The vehicles around it scattered. Haynes on the tactical channel. Good hit. Lead jammer is down. Second jammer is accelerating, moving to mid-canyon cover position. You have one more pass before it's under the overhang. Sarah brought the aircraft around in a tight bank, feeling the walls press close. The second bend was ahead. She needed the correct approach angle before she committed. She armed the second Maverick. The targeting system cycled. Nothing. She waited. The system cycled again. The tone that should have been steady fragmented, starting and stopping, unable to hold. She checked the indication panel. Lock acquisition cycling through its sequence, resetting cycling again. 3 seconds. 4. The jammer truck was moving. The overhang was getting closer. The missile was not going to give her a tone. She ran through the possibilities in the time available, which was limited. Equipment failure, combat damage from the first detonation's shrapnel. She filed those possibilities and moved to the only question that mattered. What do you do when the weapon you plan to use does not work? The GAU-8 would do it. The GAU-8 would do anything if you put it close enough. That was the fundamental contract of this aircraft. If everything else fails, the gun works. The gun always works, but close enough for a jammer truck carrying that much electronic warfare hardware and that much fuel meant inside 400 meters. At 400 meters, the blast radius of that vehicle's destruction included the airspace she would be occupying when she pulled the trigger. The A-10 was built to survive things that would destroy other aircraft. Built to survive and guaranteed to survive were different statements, and the distance between them was exactly the kind of gap that people fell into. She pushed the throttles forward and dropped lower, 180 feet. The walls were very close. She could see the texture of the rock, the individual striations in the sandstone where millions of years of weather had left their record. She came around the bend with the nose pointed at the jammer truck and the pipper on her HUD moving across the display. 380 meters. She fired. The GAU-8 produced a sound that has no good civilian equivalent, a tearing, continuous roar that seemed to come from the air itself rather than from the aircraft, a sound at a frequency that registered in your skeleton before your ears. The depleted uranium rounds crossed the distance in less time than it took to think about them crossing the distance, and they met the jammer truck at a rate that converted it from a functioning vehicle into a collection of very hot, very fast-moving fragments. The blast came up at her harder than she had calculated. The concussion hit the underside of the aircraft with enough force to kick the nose sharply upward, and Sarah was already correcting with the stick when the shrapnel found the starboard hydraulic line. She knew it had found something because the aircraft told her not through the warning panel, though that came alive a moment later, but through the feel of the controls. A subtle change in stick response, a slight increase in the pressure required to hold her line. The difference between a control surface with full hydraulic support and one beginning to work from reduced pressure. She noted it factually. She filed it. She moved to the more immediate questions. The jamming was gone. AWACS came through instantly clean and clear. Ghost 9 AWACS, you are clear across the board. Jamming envelope is down. All strike assets now available. Current threat picture shows 2 lead vehicles have broken formation and are accelerating toward the dam approach road. Estimate 6 minutes to spillway access. Copy. She was already banking for the pursuit. The 2 lead vehicles were fast, and they were using the terrain while the drivers good enough to weave between rock formations that disrupted her firing solution each time she thought she had it. The first vehicle took a burst that removed its rear axle and sent it into the canyon wall. The second pushed into a wider section and found angles she had to work around. She pulled higher to get elevation, and the shoulder-launched missile warning screamed. She dumped flares and broke hard right, and the heat seeker went past her left wing, close enough that the turbulence from its wake jolted the aircraft sideways. She recovered, found her line, and came back down, and this time the second vehicle was out of options. The pipper settled. She held the trigger until the vehicle stopped moving. Haynes's voice came through, and for the first time in this engagement, something other than controlled urgency was present in it. Ghost 9, convoy is down. All vehicles mission killed. No further movement toward the dam. The dam approach is clear. Sarah pulled up, felt the hydraulics respond sluggishly, and assessed the egress options. Back the way she had come, or forward through the river cut that connected the far end of the canyon system to open desert. The river cut was shorter. The river cut was also narrower and less predictable, and she was flying an aircraft with a developing hydraulic deficit and a left engine whose oil pressure had begun a slow documented decline. She checked the hydraulic pressure gauge. The needle was below the green arc. She went into the river cut anyway. The river cut had been carved by water over a time span that made human history irrelevant. The Colorado drainage had been working on this piece of desert since before the mountains around it finished rising, and the result was a channel that went where it wanted to go without regard for the preferences of anyone who might need to navigate it. The walls were not as tall as the backbone, but they were closer in places, barely 200 feet across, which meant less than 100 feet of clearance on each wingtip. Sarah flew it at 170 knots, slow enough for reaction time, fast enough to maintain authority. The hydraulics degraded further on the first hard turn. She felt it in the roll response, a delay between her stick input and the control surface moving, a quarter of a second. A quarter of a second is nothing in ordinary circumstances. In a canyon with walls 30 feet from your wingtips, it was a margin that required active management. She compensated with rudder, using the vertical stabilizer to supplement the sluggish aileron response. It worked. It added workload, but it worked. The AWACS signal was fragmenting from terrain, masking the canyon walls, blocking line-of-sight transmission. The signal came and went in broken phrases she had to reconstruct. What she heard in pieces was enough heat signature, 2 o'clock low possible launch team positioned along the cut. She pressed the aircraft lower, reaching for the riverbed contour. If she could stay below the angle of sight from the right bank, a shoulder-launched missile would have to track her through rock. The radar altimeter ticked down to 80 feet, then 70, and every instinct built over 20 years of flying was telling her to pull up and restore margin, and she overrode every one of those instincts and held the descent. The first launch flash came from the right bank. She rolled left hard, kicking out flares, and the missile chased the flare signature up and away from her actual flight path. The blast was behind her, and the shockwave rattled the airframe but found nothing to damage. She leveled, pushed the throttle forward to rebuild airspeed, and continued. The second launch came from the same position, a desperate follow-up, the kind you fire when you know you are out of time. She saw the launch signature before she saw the missile, and she did what she had done before, and the missile did what missiles do when they are given a better heat source to chase. Then the canyon widened into a basin, and the flatbed truck was right there. She had 2 seconds to register it. Tarp pulled back. Twin-barrel autocannon traversing toward her. The crew around it fast and professional positioned to catch an aircraft coming through the widest section at low altitude. Set there deliberately, she understood. Set there because someone had known she would take this route. She put the pipper on the truck and held the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke, and the truck and the autocannon and the crew ceased to be a problem. The hydraulics warning panel transitioned from amber to red during the firing pass. AWACS pushed through the terrain, masking again, fragmented but readable. Ghost 9 base command, tracking your position and telemetry. Egress point ahead, 90 seconds. Emergency crews standing by. Do you copy? Copy, she said. The 2 syllables were delivered in the same register she would have used to acknowledge a weather update. She had trained herself to that register. It was not a performance. It was a survival tool. She was alone. Not because the radios were silent, they were not silent. Haynes was on the channel and AWACS was attempting to maintain contact, and the base was tracking her telemetry, but because the canyon at this altitude, with these walls and these control inputs, was a place where no one else could reach her. Every decision that mattered in the next 60 seconds was hers alone. There was no chain of command in a canyon at 70 feet. There was only the aircraft and the pilot and the distance to the walls. She looked at her hands on the throttle quadrant. She had thought about these hands before. Not often, because she had learned that thinking about it served nothing, but she had thought about it. The hands that had held the throttle in October 2019. The hands that had received the targeting data and processed it through professional judgment and training and decided to roll in. The hands that had done everything correctly by every standard anyone could apply to what they had been given, and had still been the hands that gave the order that sent 3 people to their deaths. There was a version of that story in which what happened was not her fault. She had heard that version from people who meant to be kind. She understood it intellectually. She had never been able to make herself believe it, because the decision had been hers. That was the nature of being an aircraft commander. The decision lived there. You could trace the information chain back through every office and every signature and every failure, and at the end of that chain was still the moment when Sarah Voss made the final call, and 3 people who had trusted her with that call had not come home. She opened the mic. She was not calling anyone. She was not requesting anything. There was no procedure for what she was doing. She said the names quietly in the way you say names that deserve to be said aloud rather than only thought. Kowalski, a pause. Garrett, a pause. Morrow, 4 seconds of silence. The canyon walls moved past. The engines continued their work. Then she tightened her grip and kept flying. That was not resolution. That was not healing. That was the thing that comes before either of those, the acknowledgement, plain and undecorated, that these people had existed and that she had been their aircraft commander, and that both of those facts were going to be true simultaneously for the rest of her life. She was not going to put them on a ledger. She was not going to balance that ledger. She was going to carry them, and she was going to keep flying, and those 2 things were going to coexist because that was the honest version of what had happened, and she was on with versions that were less than honest. She came around the final bend of the river cut, the threat display lit. This was not the tone of a shoulder-launched missile. This was a tracking tone, the particular signature of a vehicle-mounted system that had already acquired her and was computing a firing solution. The system was positioned at the canyon mouth hull down, behind a rock formation, angled to take her in the moment she emerged from the cut. She understood immediately. An ambush set for the exit at a position that could only have been placed by someone who had known in advance precisely which way she would come out. The timing was too clean for improvisation. Whoever had positioned that system had been told. She had no mavericks that would lock. She had no altitude. She had hydraulics failing and an engine in decline in approximately 4 seconds before the system at the canyon mouth achieved a clean firing solution. She did the thing that works when nothing else works. She made herself look easy. She pulled the throttles back enough to bleed speed visibly enough to make the aircraft's energy state appear compromised enough to make the system at the canyon mouth see an aircraft already struggling and decide that this was the moment to fire. The launch flash came exactly when she expected it. She was already moving. Full right roll maximum G flares burning off the dispensers in a cascade that filled the air behind her with false targets. The missile chased the brightest heat source, which was not her. It detonated against the canyon wall in a bloom of fire and black smoke that she flew through before thinking about flying through it. In the same continuous motion, she was rolling level and bringing the nose around, and the last AGM was armed, and the targeting system, for reasons she would never fully understand, possibly the blast from the detonation resetting, something in the circuitry gave her a tone. Steady, clean, she fired. The system at the canyon mouth became a pillar of fire and black debris. She pushed the throttles forward. The walls fell away. The desert opened up on all sides and the sky came back to its full width, and she pulled the nose up slightly and took the first breath that was not measured against the distance to the next wall. The airbase was visible on the horizon present, reachable exactly far enough away that the remaining distance was a question she did not yet know the answer to. AWACS came through immediately, strong and clear. Ghost 9, we are tracking you clear of the river cut. Egress is clean. No further threats plotted on your course. She did not respond. She was looking at her gauges. Then Haynes came through, and there was something in his voice that had not been there at the beginning of this, still controlled, but carrying a weight it had not carried before. Ghost 9 SEAL Recon Alpha, for your information, we have identified the convoy's command vehicle. It separated from the main column approximately 12 minutes ago before your first engagement. The vehicle is matched to General Orrin Bass's identified transport. He was not with the convoy when you engaged it. She processed this without speaking. He was never on the convoy, Haynes continued. The convoy was a directed operation, not a command-led one. He positioned himself as an observer. We are attempting to track his current location. The desert moved under her. The airbase grew incrementally larger on the horizon. She watched the hydraulic pressure gauge continue its slow decline toward the red arc. She was still thinking about what Haynes had said when AWACS pushed through a technical advisory in the flat tone of information nobody wanted to deliver. Ghost 9, be advised. Base Signals Intelligence is tracking a broad-spectrum monitoring sweep across all Blue Mesa tactical frequencies. The sweep has been active since approximately 1400 hours today. Source is consistent with the communications methods associated with Major Crane, who is currently in custody. Assessment is that he provided the full frequency rotation schedule before his detention was completed. Someone has been listening to everything on this net since before you launched. She processed this without speaking. 40 seconds later, the frequency she was monitoring carried a new voice. She had never heard it in person. She had heard it in recordings, 2 recordings obtained through means she could not have explained to anyone with authority to ask. She had listened to them enough times that the cadence was familiar. The particular way he paused before a complete sentence. The slight flattening of vowels that placed his origins somewhere in the mid-Atlantic states. Major Voss. She said nothing. She kept flying. I've been watching today with considerable respect. A pause. You flew that canyon exactly as the intelligence said you would. The assessment of your capabilities was accurate in every detail. Her right hand adjusted slightly on the throttle. Nothing else moved. I imagine you have questions about 2019, Bass said. I'm willing to address them directly. Not because I owe you that conversation, but because you are the kind of officer who deserves a direct answer. The coordinates I authorized were accurate when I authorized them. The situation on the ground changed in the 22 minutes between my authorization and your execution. I made a judgment that the risk to your flight was acceptable given the certainty of catastrophic losses to the infantry element if the strike did not divert enemy attention. 214 men came home from that valley. They came home because of that judgment. A long pause. The carrier wave hissed. You made a judgment as well, Major Voss. You executed that mission exactly as trained and ordered. The difference between your judgment and mine is not the quality of the decision. It is the information available at the moment of decision. You have spent 6 years believing you did something wrong. You did not. Another pause. The difference between us is that I can live with mine. The frequency went quiet. Sarah looked at the desert. She looked at the airbase on the horizon. She looked at the hydraulic pressure gauge, which had entered the red, and at the left engine oil pressure, which required a shutdown decision before she reached the runway. She looked at the controls, which were giving her enough to fly, but not enough to trust fully. She did not respond to Bast's transmission. She turned off the frequency, and she set up for the approach. The airbase was 7 miles out when Sarah shut down the left engine. She did it cleanly, the way you do something practiced, often enough that the rehearsal and the reality occupy the same location in your muscle memory. Throttle back to idle fuel cutoff ignition, and the turbine that had been running for the better part of an hour wound down from its working frequency into a diminishing whine and then silence, and the aircraft leaned to the left the way it always leaned when flying asymmetric, and she corrected with rudder and held the correction. The altimeter read 4,000 feet. She began a shallow descent. The math was not complicated. One engine degraded hydraulics, no meaningful flap authority landing gear she would not trust to extend cleanly. Blue Mesa's runway was 10,000 feet long, and she needed most of it, which was why Webb had already ordered the foam. She could see the white line of fire suppressant on the center line from this distance, gleaming against the darker asphalt in the late afternoon light. She had rehearsed belly landings in simulators. Every A-10 pilot had, because the aircraft was the kind of machine that required you to prepare for the things that happen when you flew it the way it was designed to be flown. The simulator was accurate on the physics. It was not accurate on what it felt like to know that the runway below you was not a simulation and that the outcome would be whatever the outcome was going to be. She ran the checklist from memory. Landing gear, no attempt. Hydraulics. Unreliable belly landing confirmed. Flaps, minimal deployment, only asymmetric. Stall risk, not acceptable. Speed fast enough to maintain control authority through the flare, slow enough to keep the ground roll within the runway's capacity to manage it. Webb's voice came through, steady and deliberate. Ghost 9 Tower, runway is foamed and ready. Emergency response is positioned on both sides. Wind is 210 at 6 knots. You are cleared full length. This is your runway. She acknowledged. There was nothing to add. At 5 miles, she cut the right engine. The aircraft became a glider. The nose wanted to drop. She held it with back pressures on the stick, feeling the increased resistance, the hydraulics providing some assistance, but not full assistance, manual reversion doing the rest. Her arms were working, her core was working. She was flying the aircraft with her body in the way pilots flew before hydraulic systems existed, and the aircraft was responding, and that was enough. The altimeter unwound. 3,000 feet. 2,000. The runway lights were resolving from a smear of white into distinct points. She could see the foam line clearly. She could see the fire trucks on both sides of the runway, orange lights rotating. She could see further back the cluster of people along the barricade line, small figures standing completely still watching. She did not look at them. She looked at the runway. At a mile out, she made a small correction left to align with the centerline foam line precisely. At half a mile, she said to herself, not over the radio, this is what it is. It was something her first instructor had told her 20 years ago about a different kind of difficulty. When you have done everything you can do, he had said, what remains is what it is. That is not resignation. That is clarity. You fly the aircraft in front of you. She flew the aircraft in front of her. 50 feet. The desert was gone and the runway was below her, the foam white and close. She flared the nose, gently checking the rate of descent without arresting it, bleeding the last of her energy in the last seconds of flight, and then the belly of the A-10 met the foam-covered asphalt at 186 knots, and the world became noise. The impact was not a single event. It was a sequence of events compressed into the sensation of one, the initial contact sending a shock through the airframe that transmitted into her spine, her harness, her teeth, followed immediately by the grinding roar of armored metal against asphalt, followed by the spray of foam and sparks that erupted on both sides in twin white arcs that caught the runway lights and scattered them in every direction. The aircraft tried to yaw. Friction differential between contact points was pulling the nose left. She held the rudder pedals with steady, measured pressure, not fighting the yaw, but managing it, keeping it inside the boundary of what was recoverable, letting momentum maintain the rough alignment with the center line while she prevented it from departing that alignment entirely. The speed bled, 160 knots, 140, 120. The nose dipped as the last aerodynamic support left the airframe, and for a moment the aircraft's attitude was uncertain, not controlled, not uncontrolled, somewhere between, and then the nose settled onto the asphalt, and the aircraft was sliding on 3 contact points, and deceleration increased sharply, and she held the controls centered and held the nose aligned and let the runway do what runways are built to do. 80 knots, 60, 40. At 20 knots, the aircraft began to rotate slowly to the right, the friction balance finally shifting past what her remaining rudder authority could manage, and she let it rotate controlled, unhurried, and then it stopped. The grinding roar became a hiss. Foam, steam rising from contact points where metal had been hot enough to matter. The smell of scorched metal and burned hydraulic fluid, and the chemical smell of suppressant seeping into the cockpit. Sarah sat in the cockpit and did not move. She performed the instrument scan. It was automatic, 20 years deep. Dead engines, hydraulic pressure zero, fuel at empty, electrical system on battery, weapons systems safe. She moved through the shutdown sequence deliberately because the shutdown sequence was the last thing an aircraft commander did, and she was still the aircraft commander until the last item was complete. She reached for the canopy release. The mechanism was stiff, some component of the release system affected by the landing, or the shrapnel or both, and it took 2 attempts before the seal broke and the canopy swung up and cool evening air moved into the cockpit. The desert air carrying the smell of foam and dust and something burning at a great distance, which was the wreckage she had left in the backbone 22 miles away. She unstrapped, each buckle in sequence. She stood in the cockpit, climbed over the side, and dropped from the wing to the runway surface. The asphalt was warm under her boots. She stood beside the aircraft and placed her right hand flat against the fuselage. The metal was hot from the belly slide. She held her hand there anyway, feeling the heat, feeling the absence of vibration that her hand expected to find the residual sense memory of a machine that had been running hard an hour ago and had given everything it had and was now still. She said low enough that only the aircraft could hear, "You kept me in the sky. I brought you back to the ground." Then she turned toward the approaching fire crews, held up one hand, and they slowed. She began to walk. The walk from the aircraft to the barricade was approximately 200 meters. She walked it at her usual pace, the pace of someone with somewhere to be and no interest in theater. Her left collarbone ached from the harness. Her hands carried a slight tremor she categorized as adrenaline response and set aside. Her flight suit was dark with sweat along the back and sides. She was aware of the people watching. She was aware of the quality of their silence, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that required silence to be adequately held. These were people processing something they were still in the middle of understanding, and they were doing it the way serious people process serious things without noise. Chief Leland Burke broke from the ground crew line and came toward her. He was 29 years old, and he had spent the last 90 minutes watching telemetry data on a screen in the maintenance center, and he looked like he had aged a portion of a decade in that time. He stopped in front of her. He opened his mouth. He tried again. She saved him the effort. "The Maverick rack." He nodded. "I found it after you were already on the runway." The second rack had a modified lock acquisition sequence in the targeting interface. It wasn't a parts failure. Somebody adjusted the initialization parameter. A pause. "I went back through the hangar camera footage. Major Crane." She took this in. She said nothing. "He's been detained. Colonel Webb ordered it about 40 minutes ago when the camera footage came back flagged. Crane had a second phone. MPs found messages on it, encrypted, but not deeply enough." He stopped. "He sent a message just before your launch, and another one after you cleared the river cut." She looked past him to where Colonel Marcus Webb was walking toward her across the tarmac. Webb's walk was the walk of a man who carried command in his posture naturally without effort. Late 50s face carrying the particular weight of someone who had been watching a situation go far outside his planning parameters and was now doing the work of understanding what that meant and what came next. He stopped in front of her. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. "So did the convoy," she said. Something shifted in his face, not the release of tension, but the acknowledgement of it. He said, "Walk with me." They walked along the edge of the runway, away from the crowd toward the command post. The fire trucks continued their work behind them, covering the aircraft with a final foam application, orange lights sweeping the asphalt in the slow rotation. Webb spoke without preamble. "Doug Crane has been providing operational intelligence to a network associated with Orrin Bast for approximately 18 months. The messages on his second phone are consistent with what Haynes reported from the Ridge. Crane gave Bast a full picture of this installation. Approach corridors, drone relay positions, radar coverage, the complete defensive profile." A pause. "And your location and status." She kept walking. "Crane knew you were here," Webb continued. "He's been at Blue Mesa 14 months. He passed it. That's why the convoy's approach left Hangar 3 exposed. Bast wanted you in the air." Webb's voice dropped slightly, not conspiratorial, simply below the ambient noise of the base that continued its operations regardless of what had happened in the last 2 hours. "The message Crane sent after you cleared the canyon. The preliminary read is that he was reporting your survival to Bast's network." And Bast acknowledged. She looked at him. "Bast knew you survived the canyon," Webb said. "He knows you're here. He knows you're alive." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The orange lights of the fire trucks continued their rotation. Somewhere across the base, an aircraft was running its engines on a maintenance check, a routine sound that had no awareness of and no interest in what had happened on this runway in the past hour. Webb stopped walking and faced her. "Here's what I am offering you. Full inquiry. Canard Valley records pulled from classification. Complete proceedings. What happened in 2019 and what happened today are connected, and the connection is documented now in ways it was not documented before. If you want to open this formally, I will back you, personally and officially." She looked toward the hangar where the tow crew was preparing to move the aircraft. She could see its shape in the darkness beyond the runway lights, the outline she had known for 11 years now, carrying the marks of everything the past 2 hours had asked of it. "Not tonight," she said. Webb began to speak. "Marcus." It was the first time she had used his given name in the 6 years she had been at this base. It stopped him the way given names stop people landing with the slight weight of something that has been withheld and is now being offered. "I understand what you're offering. I understand what it's worth. Tonight is not the right night for that decision. I'm asking you to let me have until morning." He held her gaze for a moment, then a single nod. "Until morning," he said. "After that, I need an answer." He walked back toward the command post. She turned toward the hangar. Walt Gibbs was exactly where she expected in Bay 14, preparing the maintenance documentation that would need to begin the moment the aircraft came back under cover. Clipboard, flashlight, the unhurried manner of a man who had spent his working life doing the next necessary thing without requiring the surrounding circumstances to be anything other than what they were. He heard her come in. He made a notation, set the clipboard on the workbench, and turned. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without trying to assess what she thought of herself, simply seeing what was there. "The airframe needs full hydraulic system replacement," he said, "both main lines and the backup. Left engine requires a complete teardown, won't know the full extent until we get inside. The belly skin will tell us a story I'm not going to enjoy reading." He paused. 6 to 8 weeks minimum, probably 10. She nodded. "She'll fly again," he said, a fact, not a reassurance. The tow crew brought the aircraft through the hangar doors, slowly guiding the wingtips through the clearance on each side. The Hog moved into the bay and stopped. Tow bar disconnected. Crew stepped back. The hangar went quiet in the way hangars go quiet when the machine has returned and the immediate urgency has passed, and what remains is the longer, slower work. Sarah walked to the aircraft. The fuselage carried its new record. The belly skin scored and blackened from the landing, the metal distorted in places where the foam had not fully covered the contact points. The starboard side bore the shrapnel entry point, a small jagged hole surrounded by a starburst of displaced metal, modest-looking, until you traced what it had connected to and understood what one piece of fast-moving metal had done to the systems behind the skin. She walked the length of the aircraft, left hand on the fuselage, not assessing damage. That was Walt's work and Burke's work and the work of the maintenance team that would spend the next several weeks on it. She was doing something different. She was doing what she had done every morning for 6 years, but doing it with something changed in the quality of her attention. She was not keeping a distance from it anymore. She was present with it in a way she had not allowed herself to be. She reached the cockpit. The canopy was still open from her exit on the runway. She put her hand on the cockpit rail and looked in at the seat. The instrument panel, dark displays, blank, everything shut down. The harness hanging loose in the configuration she had left it when she unstrapped. The throttle quadrant, with the marks that accumulate on throttle quadrants from years of hands finding the same grip in the same way. She reached into the breast pocket of her flight suit. She took out the patch. She held it in the light from Walt's work lamp. Black thread on a dark backing, a hawk above a broken star, the call sign in capital letters below. The embroidery rough under her thumb, the backing stiff from years of being folded and carried. She had last worn it 7 years ago. She had carried it every day since. She had taken it out and put it away, and taken it out and put it away so many times that the folds had become permanent, the fabric holding the shape of a secret. She looked at it for a long time. Then she leaned over the cockpit rail and placed it on the seat. Not folded, not tucked away, simply placed face up in the center of the seat cushion, visible under the work lamp's light. She smoothed it once with her thumb. She stepped back. Walt was standing at the edge of the light. He had watched her without moving. Now he looked at the cockpit and at her, and he gave the smallest nod, the nod of a man acknowledging something that required no elaboration from either of them. She returned it. They stood in the quiet hangar with the aircraft between them, and the night settling around the base outside, and the silence was not empty. It held the weight of 6 years of the same work in the same place, and the long patience of someone who had kept faith with something he believed would matter, and the particular stillness of a person who has just done something irrevocable and is feeling the truth of it settle. Outside the base continued its work. Vehicles' voices at a distance, the procedural sounds of a military installation processing an extraordinary event and converting it into debriefs and after-action sequences and documentation. All of that would reach her soon enough. The debrief in the morning, Webb's question, the decision she had promised him. She knew in the way you sometimes know things before you have fully reasoned through them what the decision would be. Not because the weight of Kunar Valley had lifted, it had not, and she did not expect it to lift quickly or completely or perhaps ever. But because Bast had said something on that frequency from his position of calculated distance and careful self-justification that had been intended to diminish her and had instead clarified something she had been circling around for 6 years without finding the right angle of approach. He had said the difference between us is that I can live with mine. He had meant it as a statement in his favor. He had meant it to say that he had made a hard decision and accepted its consequences without the prolonged self-punishment she had chosen. She had turned that statement over during the approach and during the belly landing and during the walk from the aircraft, and she had found what was wrong with it. What he was calling living with it was not what she would call living with it. What he had done was construct a framework in which his decision was justified, and the deaths of Kowalski and Garrett and Morrow were a cost line that the framework absorbed. He had put them on a ledger and found that the ledger balanced in his favor, and he had called that resolution and moved forward. He had been so confident in that resolution that he had spent 18 months engineering a situation in which the last person who might threaten it would die in a canyon, and he had called that strategic necessity, and from inside his framework, it probably looked exactly like what he said it was. She had never been able to do that. For 6 years, she had believed that her inability to balance that ledger was a failure of psychological processing, something broken in her that should have been repaired by time and that had instead persisted as guilt and self-exile, and the badge turned inward and the patch in the pocket. She had believed that Bast's version of living with it was the functional version and that her version was the damaged one. She understood now that she had it exactly backward. The inability to put Kowalski and Garrett and Morrow on a ledger was not a weakness. It was the thing that made her different from Orrin Bast. It was what had kept her honest about what she had done and what she was. It had cost her 6 years. Those were real costs, and she would not pretend otherwise. But she had never stopped being the aircraft commander, the one who carries what happens on her watch without converting it into something more manageable. She had simply stopped flying while she was doing it. She was not going to stop flying anymore. She was not going to carry those 3 names as a sentence. She was going to carry them as a record the way you carry the things that matter most, not as punishment, not as something to be resolved or balanced or filed away, but as the permanent acknowledgement that they had existed and that she had been their aircraft commander, and that both of those facts were going to be true for the rest of her life, and that this was as it should be. Burke came in quietly 20 minutes later with his tablet and the preliminary maintenance assessment data and asked if she wanted to go through the hydraulic system findings before the morning debrief. She told him to sit down at the workbench, and they went through it together. Walt joining them after a few minutes, the 3 of them working through the damage documentation in the way people who keep aircraft flying work through damage documentation, methodically following the logic of systems and components from effect back to cause. At some point, Burke looked up from the tablet and said without making it anything more than a practical matter, "The duty roster for the maintenance rotation over the next 10 weeks. I was thinking you'd want to be on it." He said it in the tone of someone raising a scheduling question, not a statement about anything larger. She looked at him. 29 years old, having spent the afternoon watching telemetry data from a mission he had partly been responsible for launching in a compromised configuration, sitting across from her at a workbench, treating her like someone who was going to be here tomorrow. She said, "Put me on it." He made a note on the tablet. Walt poured coffee from his thermos. He handed her a cup without comment. She took it. When she came out of the hangar at close to midnight, the base had settled into its night configuration. The flight line quiet, the runway lights still illuminated, but the emergency vehicles gone. The foam had been cleaned from the runway surface. The tarmac was a tarmac again, holding no visible record of what had happened on it a few hours before. She stood outside for a moment. The desert night was clear and very cold the way it gets when there is no cloud cover to hold the day's warmth, and the stars were the particular density you only see in places far enough from city light to let the sky show what it actually is. The Milky Way is a structural feature rather than a suggestion of one, the kind of sky that reminds you of the scale of things that have nothing to do with runways or missions or the small urgent dramas of the people who live on this surface. She breathed the cold air. A voice behind her from the direction of the tower at a distance calibrated to be audible without being intrusive. Ghost 9. Welcome home. She did not turn around. She stood on the tarmac and let the words reach her, not as a call sign and not as a title, but as a description of a condition. She was home. That was not a simple statement, and she knew it was not a simple statement. She was home in a way that carried the full weight of what home means to someone who has been away from it longer than intended and has come back carrying things they took with them and things they acquired along the way. There was a debrief in the morning, a decision to make about Kunar and Bast and the formal proceeding that Webb had offered and that she was going to accept. There was the slow work of the aircraft's restoration and the slower, less predictable work of her own. None of it was going to be straightforward, but the patch was on the seat. She had not put it on her shoulder. She was not ready for that, and she was not going to pretend she was. What she had done was take it out of her pocket where it had lived for 6 years in the dark and place it somewhere it could be seen. That was a different thing. That was the first honest thing she had done about it since the day she folded it away. She turned and walked toward the operations building where the debrief forms were waiting and where she had promised an answer and where she would give one. In Bay 14, under Walt Gibbs's work lamp, the A-10 sat with its skin scorched and its belly marked and its systems requiring weeks of careful attention before it would be airworthy again. The patch lay on the seat where she had left it, visible, present, not a declaration and not a resolution. Something more provisional than either and more honest than both. In the valley 22 miles northeast, the Blue Mesa Dam held the river the way it had always held it, unchanged, the concrete white and solid in the darkness, 12,000 people on the other side of it, sleeping without knowing what the evening had nearly taken from them. Sarah Voss sat down at the debrief table. She pulled the first form toward her. In the block marked Mission Commander, she wrote her name, not her contractor designation, not the badge number of the woman nobody had looked at twice for 6 years. Her name, the one that had been on the badge all along for anyone who cared to read it. Voss Sarah L. She picked up her pen and began to write.